Namaste, friends. Welcome to another episode of Satsang discussing Swami Sri Yukteswar Giri's Holy Signs. We'll begin with a chant as always, this one written by Yogananda ji. Let's briefly meditate, thinking of our Guru's lotus feet. Om, peace. Good morning again, friends. We are back with Swami Sri Yukteswar Giri's wonderful book, The Holy Signs. And as it happens, we are entering some territories which are beyond me to actually explain or talk about all that much. We finished till Sutra number 6. This was last week in the first chapter of this book. I'm not quite sure if I want to address the upcoming sutras in detail because I feel like it is beyond my understanding or comprehension to fully talk about them. I'm going to touch upon some concepts which are relevant and which are useful for us to contemplate on, but I'm certainly not going to go into the details of each sutra. But I will start with Sutra number 7 and we'll see where this goes. Chitta, this is Sutra number 7 in chapter 1 called the Gospel. Chitta, the spiritualized atom in which ahankara, the idea of separate existence of the self, appears, has 5 manifestations. They constitute the causal body of the Purusha. The 5 electricities, Panchatattva, from their 3 attributes, the Gunas, Sattva, Rajas and Tamas, produce the 5 organs of senses, 5 organs of actions, and the 5 objects of sense. I'm not reading the Sanskrit words here because I don't know how many Sanskrit words I want to introduce. These 15 attributes plus mind and intelligence constitute the 17 fine limbs of the subtle body or the Linga Sharira. So, essentially Swami Yukteswar Giri is talking about how the pure essence of spirit, it is multiplying, it is descending into matter itself. We had the 4 aspects of consciousness that we experienced last week. We discussed some of that, and then we moved on from there, talking about chitta, the pure feeling nature, ego or ahankara, and then buddhi, the intellect, and mind or manas. So these are the 4 aspects that we discussed. And now these are all ideas that are even behind the causal body. He says the causal body, the causal plane is the first plane of existence, which is the plane of thoughts and ideas. And from there comes the astral plane, or the plane of energy, where these ideas start to manifest as vibrations. And then from there we have matter. When energy starts to vibrate even more, it takes gross form, and that's what we perceive as matter. Now, as I was saying, these four aspects are even behind the causal plane. The causal plane, he says, consists of the pancha tattvas, or the 5 electricities. I'm not going to go into what these are. I feel like I can quote more Sanskrit words and I can read the explanation he gives, but I've been meditating on these verses for the last few days, and I can tell you there's not a lot that I could possibly comprehend from all of this or share that is from experience. It is all mere theory, so I'm hesitant to go into depth with any of this. But he moves on to say, these 5 electricities from the causal plane, they make the Son of God. And from there, we have the 3 attributes, the gunas that we are familiar with, that we can talk about. Even it is explained widely in the Bhagavad Gita, the 3 gunas, sattva, rajas, tamas. It is the purifying or the uplifting quality, the activating or the energizing quality, and finally the darkening quality, that is tamas. So these are the 3 qualities, and all of nature is a combination of these 3 qualities, these 3 flows of energy. So he says, the 5 electricities on the causal plane, along with the 3 gunas, they produce 15 children that form the astral plane, or the linga sharira. And what are these 15 children? These are the 5 these are the 5 jnanendriyas. That's what they're called. These are the 5 jnanendriyas, or the organs of sense. Karmendriyas are the organs of action, and tanmatras, which are the objects of senses. Now, just to be very brief, because these are some important concepts, I don't want to just gloss through all of them, even though I cannot claim to have fully understood all of them in detail the way Yukteswar Giri is talking about it. The jnanendriyas are organs of sense, and tanmatras are objects of sense. So what does that even mean? In the Hindu way of how we look at sensory perception itself, it's different from how one might see it from a scientific Western perspective of just seeing these as organs that receive neurological impulses that is again interpreted through the brain, which makes them mere mechanisms. Now, in the Hindu view of creation or life itself, the 5 senses, the hearing, the sight, the smell, the taste, and the feeling from the sense of touch, these are not mere mechanisms. These are not just inanimate. They are animate because it's happening through us, but they're not merely mechanistic, that they form some kind of physiological function and all activities simply happening through the brain, but rather these are manifestations of how energy flows. These are manifestations of how energy is drawn out of us. So these organs of senses, we are not actually talking about the physical organs of senses. We are not talking about the eyes or the ears, because please remember that we are still talking about the astral plane, or the subtle body, or what Yukteswar here calls linga sharira. So in this body, there are still 5 organs of senses. There are 5 organs of senses in the astral body. That's what we are talking about. That's what the jnanendriyas are. And what are these 5 organs? They are not different from the 5 organs of senses that we know, which is smell, taste, touch, hearing, and sight. It's the same, but we are not talking about these eyes. And the distinction is important because these electricities, later on we will see in the same chapter, this energy that is flowing out, the same causal electricity that is animating these 5 organs of senses, this can either flow out, or we can neutralize that flow and draw them in. But the sense of sight is still the sense of sight even when the energy is flowing in. But rather than flowing through dual eyes, when the energy starts flowing in, it becomes a singular vision of the spiritual eye. The spiritual eye is not something we see with the external eyes. It is an inner perception. It is a perception of the light within, but it is also a perception rooted in sight, if I'm making sense. And that is still a jnanendriya. So in that way, these 5 sense organs exist in the astral plane. So he says the jnanendriyas are the organs of senses, or positive attributes of the 5 electricities, smell, taste, sight, touch, and hearing, and being attracted under the influence of the mind, constitute a body of the same. And then we have Vishaya or tanmatras, which are objects of the senses. Now, what are the objects of senses? Smell, taste, sight, touch, and sound. Objects of senses are the external stimuli. And so just like there is a positive and negative pole for any neutralization to happen, for perception to happen, there needs to be a perceiver and there needs to be a perceived. So in this particular case, the jnanendriyas are the perceiver, the sense organs, and what is perceived is the object of sense, and the neutralization or the combination of both is the experience of perception itself. So again, I hope these ideas are not just far too complex. I think they're still easy for us to follow along with. I'm not going into as much detail as Yukteswar Giri is going in these verses. But when I say objects of senses, again, I'm not talking about objects like this harmonium here or this book that I can touch and see and feel, but rather our own reception of that stimuli, which happens even on the astral plane. So that is the tanmatra, not the object that is external to us, but the objectivity of the thing that we are perceiving as we receive it. I hope that is making sense. So the jnanendriyas and the tanmatras together form sensory perception, and then there are the karmendriyas, and the karmendriyas are 5 organs of action. So generally, on the physical plane, these 5 agencies of action are hands, feet, reproductive organs, excretory organs, and the speech that is coming out of the mouth. So these are the 5 organs of actions. We are receiving through the sensory organs and we are responding through the organs of action. And on the astral plane, these organs of action still exist because the same expression is happening first energetically before it can manifest on the physical plane. And so exactly, so the 5 organs of action on the astral plane are excretion, generation, motion, which is the feet, manual skills, which are the hands, and speech, which comes through the mouth. So all of these 15 different elements together form the Linga Sharira. And he goes on to describe more things. I'm going to skip verse Sutras 11 and 12 here. The one comment that I will make here is, again, going back to reiterate this point about how this Hindu view is the Eastern view of senses, how different it is from the Western view of, or rather I should say the Western scientific view of the senses themselves, which look at these senses as mechanisms, whereas in the Indian view, these senses are not mechanisms, they are conscious agencies. They are conscious agencies through which energy is drawn out of the body. In the Bhagavad Gita, again and again, Krishna talks about the senses as being an agency for Maya, which is the same idea that Yukteswar Giri is talking about here. If you were to think about it from a very practical standpoint in our own life or meditation practice, the senses are constantly drawing that energy out. If you think about it, you may not think about it this way honestly, because what is distracting you, let's say, from our own meditations when we are having those restless thoughts, when we are trying to go deep, what are you thinking about? You're not thinking about, sometimes you are, but most often you're not thinking about some kind of sensory experience that is making you restless. Let's say, oh, I want to have that particular piece of cake, I desire for this or desire for that sensory experience. Sometimes maybe, but most often the experience that is drawing us out is, oh, I wish I had said this to that person. Oh my gosh, I'm worried about this particular thing that I need to do tomorrow. It feels like the emotional reality that is disturbing us and that is causing that restlessness is somehow something of the mind, whereas senses are of the body. But truthfully, again, this is something that Yoganandaji describes in great detail in chapter 26 in the autobiography of a yogi, the chapter on the science of Kriya Yoga. These senses are like telephone because they're constantly drawing energy out of the body. And true meditation is the act of turning these energies inward to draw that energy back from the senses into our own subtle spine. Because if we were not bound by the body, if the body was not causing restlessness, if those sense telephones, the reason why Yoganandaji called them the sense telephone is because back in those days, you have to remember this was in the 1920s and 30s, where you had these big telephones that sat on a desk. I come from a generation where I grew up with that, but maybe, kids that are in college or going to school, high school these days, they've never seen a phone. For them, phone is always something that you carry in a pocket. But I remember those phones that had a wire and you had to pick it up like this and keep it to your ear and talk. Maybe some of you are familiar with that. Most of you obviously are because you're from that generation. But that telephone is just sitting there. It doesn't look like it's doing anything, but it is doing something. It is waiting for that phone call. If I were to call a phone that is just sitting there, immediately that phone is going to ring, which means the phone was constantly in a state of receptivity. The phone was constantly engaged in listening. And that's what the senses do. The senses are just there. You're sitting still in meditation, but they're constantly in a state of receptivity. And because of that, a fair amount of energy is drawn towards the senses and processing input. So even though you might be thinking about, an argument that you had with your spouse or a meeting that you have tomorrow, which doesn't sound like a sensory desire or a sensory experience, it is still caused by that fundamental restlessness that is rooted in the senses, which is constantly drawing the energy out of the body. So in that sense, these indriyas, or the senses that we are talking about, are at the root of how energy is drawn out of us. They are the foundational mechanisms through which Maya works, through which we are drawn out to act in this world. Now, as I said, I'm going to skip Sutras 11 and 12. I'm not sure if I totally understand what Yukteswar Giri is talking about, and that's not a surprise. As I said, this section that we are dealing with right now is pretty esoteric and clearly far beyond my comprehension for the most part. Sutra 13 is also not very different. He talks about the universe being differentiated into 14 spheres of 7 swargas and 7 patalas, 7 astral worlds that are superior to us, 7 astral worlds that are below us. And he gives the names of those worlds, and he talks about what these worlds are and what exists in them. Well, I won't go into all of them, but there is an interesting reference which I will talk about here, because the 7 worlds, that swargas that he's talking about, for those of you that grew up practicing any Hindu rituals, or especially what is called sandhya, which is a ritual of practicing the Gayatri mantra, often associated with a sacred thread ceremony in India. This is perhaps only for those that grew up in an Indian household and are part of this culture. You often recite the names of these 7 swargas, or the 7 astral worlds, and they are Bhu, Bhuvaha, Swaha, Maha, Jana, Tapa, Satyam. So these are the 7 astral spheres. In this book, Yukteswar Giri calls it Bhuloka, Bhuvarloka, Swarloka, Maharloka, Janaloka, Tapaloka, and Satyaloka. And here Yukteswar Giri gives a detailed explanation of what these 7 astral spheres are. I mean, I could read all this description, but there is really very little I can add there, because I don't have any experience of any of these astral worlds that he's talking about. The one thing I did want to say is the first 3 spheres. The first one is called Bhuloka, which is the lowest sphere of gross material creation, which is visible to everyone, which is always visible. The second sphere is the Bhuvarloka, is the sphere of electric attributes, and as the gross matters of creation are entirely absent from the sphere, it is conspicuous by the presence of fine matters only. And the Swarloka, around this atom is Swarloka, the sphere of magnetic aura, the electricities. This sphere being characterized by the absence of all of creation, even the organs and objects and the fine material things, and is the great vacuum. In the Gayatri mantra that most of you may have heard or are familiar with, we always start by acknowledging these 3 worlds. Om Bhur Bhuva Swaha. Those are the 3 worlds that Yukteswar Giri is talking about. Bhuloka, Bhuvarloka, and Swarloka. Bhu, Bhuva, Swaha. And these 3 worlds we are referring or invoking. Om is outside of all of this, the cosmic vibration. We have to start from where we are, which is the gross material plane, and we are making our connection to this world of electricities and magnetic aura that is beyond sensory objects. And we are trying to make that connection. We are bowing to the spirit that permeates all these 3 worlds, and then we say, Tat Savitur Varenyam, I bow to that supreme light that is within me, that is the supreme most. Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yo Naha Prachodayat. May it purify my thoughts, may it guide me, may it enlighten me. So we acknowledge these 3 astral worlds, because while on this plane we have to tune into the next 2 astral worlds where there is help waiting for us. Let me just put it that way, because all of the higher energies, the angels and the divine vibrations present in these worlds are going to lift us and refine us a little bit more. And from there we can move on to the other worlds until in the seventh astral world we can be purely united in perfect union with the spirit. But I just thought that's an interesting thing to mention. And then he talks about the seven patalas, or the seven lower worlds. Again, these are all material worlds that he's describing. I feel like often he's explaining a lot of these concepts, and he is also giving corresponding verses from the book of Revelations in the Bible. I'm going to skip all of this quite safely, because clearly there is a lot of spiritual analogy that he's drawing between Sankhya philosophy, the Hindu way of looking at things, and the book of Revelations. However, for me, most of this is just theory, so you can always find the book and read through them, and maybe they'll make more sense to you. But for right now, since it's just mere theory and not something that is part of my experience, I'm going to move on. I'm going to skip Sutra 14 as well. Sutra 14, he's talking about the Purusha being covered by the 5 koshas or sheaths. I'm not talking about this only because I already have recorded another video. If you're watching this on YouTube, I will link that previous video where I make some references to koshas and the way Yukteswar Giri explains it here. Again, what the koshas are sheaths of ignorance, or sheaths that stand between us and the true perception of spirit itself. And the 5 koshas, since I'm talking about here, I'll just mention them here. The first kosha is the heart, the chitta itself. The second kosha is called, so I should actually start from the 5th kosha, because that's the grossest of all. The 5th kosha is gross matter, which is called Annamaya kosha. That's what we are bound by. We are bound by all 5 sheaths. We are covered. We cannot perceive anything that is outside of the world of matter. And once we peel off the completely matter-bound sheath of Annamaya kosha, then we go to prana, or the 4th kosha, which is Pranamaya kosha. We become aware of subtle energies. Once we are able to get past being bound completely by the world of senses and matter, we can perceive things on the level of prana. And then we move on further into Manomaya kosha, where we can perceive things on the level of the mind or the organs of senses. And when we are able to peel that off too, when I say peel, it's like peeling layers of an onion, where we are completely bound by everything and we are taking one by one away, so that we can perceive the kernel of truth within. The second kosha is Buddhi, or Jnanamaya kosha, where we are able to perceive magnetic aura electricities. That's what Yukteswar Giri mentions here. I don't know what that means. The intelligence that determines what is truth. And finally, the last one is Anandamaya kosha, which he calls heart or chitta, where we can feel that pure bliss of existence itself. So these are the 5 koshas that we eventually have to pierce through as we move towards our union with spirit. I'm going to move on to Sutras 15, 16, and 17, because I think they have more for us to talk about. This is Sutra 15 and 16. I'm going to read the literal translation of it. Just as the objects seen in our dreams are found, just as the objects seen in our dreams are found when we awake to be insubstantial, so our waking perception likewise are unreal, a matter of inference only. This is actually a very interesting verse, and I'm going to read the explanation that he writes here. When man compares his ideas relating to gross matters conceived in the wakeful state with his conception of ideas in the dream, the similarity existing between them naturally leads him to conclude that this external world also is not what it appears to be. Now, as I said already in this book, Yukteswar Ji draws a lot of natural conclusions which may or may not be as natural to us as it is to him. But the point is very important. This takes me back to, I think in one of the previous classes, not on this book, but in a different class series, I was talking about The Matrix, the movie Matrix, if any of you have seen it, and I made a section about its analogies and comparison with the Hindu way of life and the Hindu philosophy of how we see things. And he refers to the same thing here. Basically, what he is saying is, just as you realize that your dreams are insubstantial when you wake up, similarly, this world is also insubstantial. And because your dreams are insubstantial, likewise, this is also insubstantial. It is just natural. That's what Yukteswar Ji is saying here. But what he really means is, well, the way I interpret it and how we can understand or realize this is just how the matrix is built. Because what happens in a dream? In dream, we have all kinds of experiences. We experience all sensory perception. We see, we hear, we go through entire experiences that are completely self-contained, that are also insubstantial, that have no fundamental reality. Now, what Yukteswarji is saying, if you can go through all those experiences inside of yourselves and all of them can be completely false and insubstantial, similarly, when we are navigating through this world, we are going through the same kind of experiences. We are hearing, we are seeing, we are participating in real world experiences. They also have to be insubstantial. Because if they are insubstantial in your dream, why would they be substantial here? Because what you're experiencing is not outside. What I'm experiencing is not the weather. What I'm experiencing is not the objects around me. I'm experiencing my own self. I am experiencing the consciousness that I'm dwelling in, or even in a physiological sense, I'm experiencing the neural responses of my brain. I'm not really experiencing the weather. I'm not experiencing love from a friend. I'm not experiencing, a particular song or an object or a delightful treat in front of me. I'm experiencing my response to them. So all that I'm seeing, all that I'm living in, all that is ever part of my reality is my response. The thing itself is not something that is ever substantial because my experience is contained in my response. That's what happens in dreams. So what you're experiencing is just your creation. You are experiencing a reality that you're projecting onto the fundamental plane of consciousness. And in the same way, he's saying, just as that is insubstantial, you know that is insubstantial when you wake up and realize that was just a dream. In the same way, all our experiences here are insubstantial. Just as in the Matrix, what is true, what is untrue, there is no way to say it because everything is untrue because we are not experiencing anything except what is happening inside of us. Our state of mind, the neurons moving in our brain and the signals that they're communicating, that's all we are experiencing. We are not experiencing anything outside of us. Anyway, as abstract and philosophical as it is, it's an interesting idea to think about or contemplate on. And Sutra 17 is a beautiful verse which we will end with today. What is needed is a guru, a savior who will awaken us to bhakti or devotion and to perceptions of truth. So, again, this goes back to, I didn't even think about it as I was preparing, but it's all coming to me right now. It goes back to the whole Matrix movie, because you cannot wake up from the Matrix. You have to be woken up from the Matrix. Somebody has to come and release you. Somebody has to come and tell you. Somebody has to give you the option, and that is the guru. That's why we cannot figure all of this out. We need a guru, and he also goes on to say he has to awaken bhakti. He has to open our heart, and we have to be able to receive his consciousness. This is not an idea that he can teach us. And I'll read some sections of his commentary on this particular verse. Following affectionately the holy precepts of those divine personages, man becomes able to direct all of his organs of senses inward to their common center, the sensorium or sushumna dwara, the door to the interior world, where he comprehends the voice like a particular knocking sound, the word Amen, Om, and sees the God-luminous body of Radha, symbolized in the Bible as the forerunner or John the Baptist. So he goes on to describe a few more Bible verses. We will end here, but I just want to, since we are already in this verse, I want to finish by sharing some of those commentaries here as well. He talks about the idea of baptism itself, because what he's saying is, when the Guru comes and when he awakens us by drawing all those jnanendriyas, all those sense organs and the objects inward, and then the energy enters what he calls sushumna dwara. The energy moves away from the dual currents of Ida and Pingala, and it's able to enter the central current of sushumna, and the kundalini is able to awaken. That is when we hear the sound of Om. We hear this cosmic sound, the sound of Holy Ghost itself, and that is what cleanses us. And then he goes on to say, Ganga, Yamuna, Jordan, and all the holy streams are actually symbols for the sound of Om. I'm going to read his own explanation of it. From the peculiar nature of the sound issuing as it does like a stream from a higher unknown region, and losing itself in the gross material creation, it is figuratively designated by various sects of people by names of different rivers that they consider as sacred. For example, Ganga by the Hindus, Yamuna by the Vaishnavas, and Jordan by the Christians. So when we talk about the sacredness of these rivers and being baptized in these rivers, we are talking about being baptized in the holy sound of Om. I'm going to continue reading and we'll finish here. Through this, his luminous body, man, believing in the existence of true light, becomes baptized or absorbed in this holy stream of sound. This baptism, so to speak, is the second birth of man and is called Bhakti Yoga, without which man can never comprehend the real internal kingdom or the kingdom of God. And then he gives these Bible verses. That was the true light which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. He is born again in that holy sound of Om, in that stream of cosmic consciousness that is awakened by the touch of the Guru, that is awakened by that perception that we have when all those energies are directed away from the senses into the inner stream of Sushumna, into that Sushumna Dwara. So friends, we will end our session here today and we'll pick up from the next verse next week. Until then, God bless you all.